Okay, brethren, for a few weeks now, we've been looking at the topic of living a righteous life. Some people say we can't do that because all our righteousness is but filthy rags. Hopefully we've seen that's not the case. And living a righteous life is something you and I should aim at, endeavour to live in such a fashion. One reason is because that would be pleasing to God. But the other reason we've been looking at the last couple of weeks is if you and I live a righteous life, that hopefully means we are not living a sinful life. We're avoiding sin, and if we avoid sin, then we avoid the perils and the danger of a sinful life. And one of the principles we've seen several times in the last couple of weeks is that, as the scripture itself says, you and I will reap what we sow. If you sow to the flesh, to your carnal nature, you'll have certain consequences, a certain harvest. If you sow to the Spirit, good things, then you'll reap a much better harvest. But you will reap what you sow. The Apostle Paul mentions that, and he says, don't be deceived. This is how it works. You will reap what you sow. So be careful what you sow. And if you sow to the flesh, if you make very sinful choices, you will reap, in all likelihood, a very upsetting, very bad harvest. And to illustrate that, we were looking initially at King Saul, a man who started small in his own eyes, handpicked by Almighty God to be the first king of Israel, and he ended up in a very bad way, replaced, of course, by King David, a man whom God chose, a man after God's own heart. And for many years, David lived a good life. But then, of course, we know about his serious sin, adultery with Bathsheba, having Uriah essentially murdered. And, of course, although David thankfully repented, heartbroken, and was forgiven by God, the consequences of David's sin were horrific in his own family. You know, many sons murdered or died in battle and so on. His daughter Tamar was raped. There was civil war in the land, and on it went. You know, very distressing set of consequences for, you know, a night's passion and so on. Well, we're going to look at one more today from the same era. So you had Saul, David, and then next in line you had Solomon. So we're going to look at Solomon's life today and see what you and I can learn looking at this principle of sowing and reaping, avoiding sin, living righteous, and therefore avoiding the dangers that even somebody like Solomon suffered. Now, Solomon was the third king of Israel. You had Saul, David, and then Solomon. Solomon was the son of David and Bathsheba. God rather favoured Solomon in many ways, but Solomon turned out to be the third king of Israel and also, in a sense, the last king of Israel. Because following Solomon's death, the kingdom split. The northern tribes and the southern tribes. So in that sense, Solomon was the last king of the United Kingdom of Israel back in those days. Now, Solomon became king at a fairly young age, it is believed. You can't find it in the scriptures exactly, but most commentators suggest that Solomon probably became king quite young. I've seen it as young as 12. Not impossible. Other kings like Josiah were only about 8 when they became kings. So Solomon could have been as young as 12, might have been 15, 16, 17. Nobody's exactly too sure, but probably somewhere in that sort of region as a youngish teenager. He lived for 40 years, as we'll see later, and that would suggest he died perhaps in his early to mid-50s, which you've got to say is a little bit on the young side, right? 50, 52, 55, 58, not a great age. I wonder what might have led to such a short life. Well, let's start by looking at 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, and we're going to read verses 3 through 15, when things really start to happen for Solomon and differentiate him from really anybody else. So chapter 3, verse 3. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. That might have been a slight problem early on. It wasn't to idols. This was permissible, but not necessarily advisable. But moving on. Now the king went to Gibeon, which is the great high place, to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night. And God said, "Ask, what shall I give you?" Quite something. How many of us wouldn't mind a sort of dream like that, where God turns up and says, "Ask, Jamie, what do you want?" "Ooh, I'd like this super duper motor car, and I'd like my own private jet plane, and what would you ask for?" Well, Solomon at this time of his life, still quite young, says, verse 6, "You have shown great mercy to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child." Debate as to whether that means I'm just humble, which is certainly true, or actually still literally a little child, 12, 14, 15. All right, nobody's entirely too sure. "I do not know how to go out or come in." I'm very inexperienced, which you would be. If you were king at the age of 12 or 15, you'd be fairly inexperienced, right? Verse 8, "And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" Which is a great request. I'm not talking about Cadillacs and BMWs and things of that nature. I want to be wise. This is your people, God. This is your nation. This is your promised land. I want to know how to make good decisions that will help this people along the way they should go. Verse 10, "The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, because you have asked this thing and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words." So wisdom, discernment, ability to judge, that's yours. It's already yours. "See, I have given you a wise and an understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you." Solomon appears to be unique. "And I've also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways," if this is not something that would be guaranteed, already God has said, okay, wisdom is yours, honor is yours, riches is yours, that's done. I've given that to you, that's already yours. But if, and this is a conditional statement, "if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days." So early on God said, you've not asked for a long life or riches or honor. Well, tell you what, because you've asked for wisdom, I'll give you riches, I'll give you honor. But what's missing here, as you can see, is long life, right? That's not currently given to Solomon. God has held back the opportunity or the blessing of a long life, but God holds it out there as a possibility. If you walk in my ways, if you demonstrate that you're loyal and faithful to me, then I will lengthen your days and you live to be whatever, I don't know, 100, 150, perhaps, right? Verse 15, "Then Solomon awoke, and indeed it had been a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, offered up burnt offerings, peace offerings. He made a feast for all his servants. So here is a very young, but apparently one of the wisest men, probably the wisest man ever to live, right? And which is going to be great, of course, for Solomon and great for the nation because their king is going to be super wise. So that's a great start to Solomon's life. He's a young man, he's got wisdom, he's got riches, and he's going to be honored above almost anybody. It's a great start. Let's move on to 1 Kings chapter 3 and read verses 16 to 28, because this introduces us to one of the best known examples of Solomon's wisdom, right? He's been given this incredible wisdom that God can give to Solomon, or of course to you and to me, right? And here's one of the best known illustrations. Now 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened, the 3rd day after I had given birth, that this woman also gave birth. And we were together, no one was with us in the house except the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night, took my son from my side, while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I rose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was, dead. But when I examined him in the morning, indeed, he was not my son whom I had borne." The other woman said, "No, but the living one is my son, the dead one is your son." The first woman said, "No, the dead one is your son, the living one is my son." And thus they spoke before the king. "It's mine, not hers. No, it's not hers, it's mine." And of course, Solomon, who might still be just very young here, teenager perhaps, is thinking, "Oh, okay then." So the king said, verse 23, "The one says, 'This is my son who lives, and your son is the dead one.' The other says, 'No, your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one.' And the king said, 'Bring me a sword.'" This is obviously what you'd call for. So they brought a sword before the king, and you can imagine people thinking,
Why do I want a sword?
"Why does he want a sword? There's a woman over there, She claims the living child's hers. She claims it's hers. And the king says, 'Bring me a sword.'" Curious, what's this all about? So they brought the sword before the king, verse 25, and the king said, "Divide the living child in 2, and give half to one and half to the other." Well, is that fair? Then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, "Oh, my lord, give her the living child, by no means kill him." The other said, "Yes, let him be neither mine nor yours, but chop him up." Right? So the king answered and said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother." Right? Pretty obvious, really. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice, which, of course, is what kings did in those days. The king was a supreme leader, and if you had any sort of debates, any major issues, you could go to the king, and he would attempt to exercise justice and judgment. Well, that was one of the first pieces of evidence to the people of Israel that, oh, this guy is something special, right? And that led to a number of years when the land of Israel was peaceful and prosperous. I look at chapter 4. Chapter 4, let's read verses 20 and 21. "Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. So Solomon reigned over all kingdoms, from the river," that would be Euphrates, I imagine, "to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life." So nearby nations would be sending, as it says, tribute, taxes and so on, to Solomon. And the people were rejoicing. prosperous. Verses 25 to 34. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. So safety, freedom, prosperity, a wise king, the people rejoicing under his shadow, under his protection. Verse 26, Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. That's potentially a problem. As we see later, God said, don't multiply horses. Well, that looks like multiplied horses. And these governors, each man in his month, provided food for King Solomon and for all who came to King Solomon's table. There was no lack in their supply. They also brought barley and straw to the proper place for the horses and steeds, each man according to his charge. And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart, like the sand on the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. Then it names a few, than Ethan and Heman and Chalcol and Darda, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. So his fame spread far and wide. He spoke 3,000 proverbs. His songs were 1,005, so quite a songwriter. Also he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon, even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish, so insects and fish. And men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. It says, Solomon spoke of trees and birds and insects. Obviously, God gave him tremendous knowledge and wisdom to explain, why birds migrate, to explain how trees get their leaves in the spring and how they fall off and why they fall off in the autumn. Why the stars shine and why stars are different. Solomon knew it all. He had tremendously wide knowledge and understanding and insight of where winds come from, where the rain comes from, all of that. Just incredible knowledge and wisdom. So a spectacular beginning to this young man's reign. And of course the people of Judah and Israel were able to benefit from that. And it says there, the nations around, the kings of the earth, heard about Solomon's wisdom and admired it. They envied it, as you and I might do, and think, oh, wish I had a fraction of the wisdom of Solomon. Wish I knew a little bit more about this, and this. Well, of course, the answer is that the wisdom came from God, and God's still there. And if you and I would like at least some wisdom, then we should be able to ask for it, which is precisely what we're told. If you hold your place there, because we'll be coming back at some stage, and look at James chapter 1, read verses 2 to 8. So James chapter 1, reading verses 2 through 8 with the topic of wisdom in our minds. Obviously God gave Solomon a level of wisdom and understanding and insight that perhaps no other person's ever shared. But God's still there, and God is still available for those that come to him and request wisdom. Verse 2, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Well, typically we fail at that verse, because most of us do not count it all joy when we fall into diverse trials, do we? We immediately start whinging, complaining, shouting, and why me? Why me, God? Why can you have done it to somebody else? Why is it me? All the time, it's always me. So, but the scripture says the reverse. Count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience or perseverance. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. And here we go. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally or generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Assuming the context in these various trials that we occasionally fall into, We have a choice of complaining and murmuring and so on, which we of course generally do. But in context, if you lack wisdom, I take that to mean in this trial, you're not too sure how to deal with the trial. You're not sure whether to go to the left or the right or stand still or reverse a bit. And that's in the trial, we ask for wisdom to deal with the trial. I think the context is all one topic. Verse 6, but let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind, blown this away and that away and then blown the other way. For let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man or woman, unstable in all his ways. So asking for wisdom does also require that we ask in faith with no doubting. And then verse 7 says, the one who doubts, let not that man suppose he will receive anything from the Lord. No means any wisdom or anything. The principle being that whatever you and I ask God for, we ought to ask in faith with no doubting. All right? Otherwise, we're like this wave of the sea blowing this way and that way and up and down and inconstant. There's no stability there. There's no assurance there. Right? No. But the point I'm making basically is, of course, that wisdom is available. James, the writer, says, if you lack wisdom in your difficulties and your problems and trials, go to the Father, ask for wisdom. He gives wisdom generously, provided you ask in faith. All right? And if you think about it, we're not going to turn there, but in 1 Corinthians 12, which we're not turning to, you have got a list of the gifts of the Spirit. Right? There are 9 gifts mentioned there by the Apostle Paul. One of the gifts of the Spirit, in fact, the first gift of the 9 is the word of wisdom. So in other words, God from time to time to church members, for the good of all, will give a word of wisdom, a message of wisdom. That's a gift of the Spirit. So God is still giving wisdom for those who need it and ask for it, and sometimes he just gives it anyway. Gift of the Spirit. So let's jump ahead in the story here and see how King Solomon, how the nations around him reacted to his fame and his wisdom. That's in 1 Corinthians 10, if we turn there. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Jumping slightly ahead in years, but we're talking about the great wisdom which he showed in this illustration with the 2 babies, the dead baby, the live baby. And his wisdom sort of grew and spread, and all the nations eventually come to realize that this man is something really special. So 1 Kings 10, let's read verses 1 to 10. Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. And many people say there was many scholars say there was no Queen of Sheba, but Jesus refers to her and Solomon, so I think she was a real person. She came to Jerusalem, verse 2, with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold, and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So here's a huge retinue, a huge procession. Some other scholars say this is probably the biggest royal procession in all history. Nobody's too sure exactly where Sheba is. Some people think it might be around Ethiopia or that sort of direction, Yemen perhaps. Others think it's just Egypt. It's not at all clear, but potentially she's come upwards of nearly 1,500 miles with many, many camels, much gold, much spices and so on, and probably scores and scores and scores of attendants. She is, after all, a very wealthy queen. All right? So this is quite a journey, taking, one imagines, a number of weeks, if not longer, possibly months, with all this wealth and probably soldiers to protect it from, bandits and so on. Quite a procession. Would have made a big impact in the world of those days. So she spoke to Solomon about all that was in her heart. Verse 3, so Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. Who knows what she asked? Migration, how animals are born, why the sky is blue, why the sun's so warm, whatever else, whatever came into her mind that she was really curious about, wondered about, she asked Solomon. He's got the answers. He's got them all, right? And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Took her breath away. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom," and this could be 1,000 miles away, right? "However, I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard." It's even shared the stories and thought, well,
Can't be true.
can't be true. I mean, maybe part of it's true, a lot of it's exaggerated. I'll go and have a look myself because I'm curious about this man and his prosperity and his wisdom. She gets her and says, "You know what? They only told me a fraction of it. This is far better in reality." Verse 8, "Happy are your men and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord has loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness." And then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such abundance of spices as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. She was a very wealthy lady, and she was real. Jesus, like I said earlier, he did mention that, the Queen of the South, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and then says Jesus, oh, by the way, a greater than Solomon, is here, talking clearly of himself. And you have to wonder a little bit, well, here's a Gentile, don't really like that term, but I think we mostly understand it. Here's a Gentile who came maybe 1,000 miles to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Jesus says, I'm greater, which he was obviously, than Solomon. Then you ask today in 2021, how far are people willing to go today to hear the wisdom of Jesus Christ, who's greater than Solomon, right? People in those days went a long way to hear Solomon's wisdom. What about today? The answer is really most people can't be bothered. I mean, most people in the Western world, at least, Europe and North, Central, South America, whatever, they know about Jesus Christ, at least in part, because nearly all keep Christmas, which is allegedly about the birth of Jesus Christ, so they know that little bit. Most of them keep Easter, which is about the death and resurrection of the same person, Jesus Christ, so they believe, and yet most of them can't be bothered. They wouldn't walk one step to find out more about this alleged person, Jesus Christ. They can't be bothered. And even when you get inside, churches, most people can hardly be bothered. I mean, the various surveys have shown that perhaps only 1 person in 5 who goes to church reads the Bible on a daily basis. 80% don't. And a lot of people in churches who would hold themselves as Bible-believing, church-attending, Sundays typically, of course, most of those people never read the Bible, right? And I would hate to ask among the churches of God just how much Bible reading and Bible study people do. You sort of tend to assume they do quite a lot, but I have some doubts there. I was reading an article this week of a guy who says he reads the Bible all the way through 3 times a year. He's now on his 93rd reading. He's not a Church of God person. I can't think there'd be many who would fall into that category. Hopefully there are some somewhere. No, I'm not quite there yet. Actually, I'm rather a long way behind. 93 times? Don't think I'll get that far if I live to be 100. So, but the point is that, Jesus, I think, is disappointed that people in his day wouldn't come in large numbers to hear the wisdom of Jesus Christ, even though somebody like the Queen of Sheba, the Queen of the South, would travel a long way to see Solomon and hear his wisdom. Puts things in perspective, the wrong perspective. Now, Verse 10 there, where are we? Verse 10. She gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such abundance of spices as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. I give you a hint of her wealth, because the amount of gold that she gave there to Solomon, it's hard to put an exact price on the gold back in those days with the value of gold today, but approximately $175 million of gold as a gift. Right? That's a reasonable gift. And how much wealth does she have that she can give this guy $175 million of gold? And then spices, it says there never again came such an abundance of spices. Now, I mean, you might use some spices in your kitchen, but back in those days, spices were worth an awful lot. We've been to Istanbul a number of times, and they've got this huge, well, they've got a number of them, but particularly big spice bazaar, spice market, which you can walk around for hours, and you're just bombarded with the colours of all the spices, with the scent and the aroma of the spices. I mean, it sort of knocks your eyes out. And some of the spices are, very, very expensive. I mean, the most expensive one I think we saw over there was saffron.
The saffron.
I mean, you get a little tiny, bottle of saffron in some of the spice shops, and you get these like threads, threads of saffron, and there's different sort of qualities of saffron. But some's like, how much? 100 quid, £100 for a little tiny. So who knows what the spices were worth. So she was a very, very wealthy queen, and gave all this money and spices and precious stones to Solomon. Look at verses 14 and 15, same chapter. It's moved on a little bit now. It's just talking about just how much money came into the land of Israel to the king. The weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. Interesting number, isn't it? 666. Besides that, from the traveling merchants, from the income of traders, from all the kings of Arabia, from the governors of the country. And that's a basic 666 talents of gold is at least $1 billion or $10 billion. Hard to equate the numbers exactly, but it's a lot of money as your default basic, right? Verses 23 to 25. So King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. Now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules at a set rate year by year. So you get the picture. Solomon is world famous. He's super wealthy, right? Incredible. He's got everything, right? There's not much missing. And you think, well, what could go wrong? You've got the wisdom. You've probably got the good looks. You've got the fame. You've got money everywhere you look. What could go wrong? Well, of course, another wise man who came a bit later said, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and suffers the loss of his own soul? Which unfortunately we're going to see is the most likely outcome of this very promising young man. So I'm afraid trouble lies ahead, but before we get there, let's look at probably the greatest achievement of his career, and probably the greatest building, the greatest edifice ever erected on planet Earth. Back to 1 Kings 5. 1 Kings chapter 5, I'm going to read verses 1 to 7. Of course, we're talking about the construction of the temple of Solomon. Verses 1 through 7. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon because he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram had always loved David. Then Solomon sent to Hiram, saying, You know how my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God, because of the wars which were fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. peace, safety, prosperity. And behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to my father David, saying, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, he shall build a house for my name. Now therefore, command that they cut down cedars for me from Lebanon, and my servants will be with your servants, and I will pay you wages for your servants, according to whatever you say. For you know that there is none among us who has a skill to cut timber like the Sidonians. So it was when Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, blessed be the Lord this day, blessed be Jehovah this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people. So, Solomon's asking Hiram, who's got guys who know how to produce timber and wood, carpentry and so on, to sort of start cutting down, and he'll provide guys to help. If you look at verses 13 to 18, we get a sort of indication of the scale of this exercise. So verse 13, then King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel. The labor force was 30,000 men. Sounds quite a few. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home, 30,000 in a sort of rota. Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. That's quite a lot. That's just cutting trees and preparing, lumber and timber. Verse 15, Solomon, this is additionally, Solomon had 70,000 who carried burdens and 80,000 who quarried stone in the mountains, besides 3,300 from the chiefs of Solomon's deputies, they'd be like the overseers, who supervised the people who labored in the work, right? And the king commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones, hewn stones, to lay the foundation of the temple. So Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gebalites quarried them, and they prepared timber and stones to build the temple. So the number of bodies there is nearly 200,000. 200,000. That is a huge workforce to build one sort of building. By comparison, when the Empire State Building was built way back in 1910s, 1920s, there were just over 3,000 workers. Now, because people manufacturing steel and glass to supply, but the actual construction team was just over 3,000. And here we got 200,000. This is quite a job being done. Verses 37 to 38 gives us the timing of the temple's construction. In the 4th year, that's of Solomon's reign, so if he was 12, he would now have been 16. If he was 16, he'd now be 20. Nobody's too sure. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its details and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it, all right? So he started when he was 20. He's only 27 now, and he's just constructed the most gorgeous, incredible building ever. And he probably still in his 20s, right? He could be just 22 or 23. Maybe he's nearly 30, right? And this is some building. The amount of gold in it, 8 million pounds of gold, which I checked this morning, and the current rate, the gold value, as you know, fluctuates quite a lot, but today's value, that's about $170 billion of gold. $170 billion of gold. Amount of silver, 76 million pounds. Another 25 billion. Overall, the cost of the temple in terms of materials is 200 billion, 300 billion, 400 billion, who knows? Plus, of course, all the labor costs, which I'm sure aren't even counted here. So what's that, $1 trillion? If you include the labor costs at today's values, maybe more, right? I don't think there's ever been a building like God's temple ever before or ever since, right? It's a dwelling place, after all, for Jehovah God. It's going to be superb. And the architect, do you know who the architect was? Well, Jehovah God. He gave the plans to David. So even the plans, the outline, the construction, the the length, the height, the width. This was phenomenal. And this is another part of the great beginning to Solomon's life, because he started it in his 4th year of his reign. Like I say, he's probably only mid-20s-ish, maybe late 20s when he finishes the greatest building of all time. That's quite a start for this very wise young man who has the potential to live for a very long time and achieve a huge amount. But perhaps a warning sign starts just here, the next verse, chapter 7, verse 1. So it says, he was 7 years, the last verse of chapter 6, he was 7 years in building the temple, but Solomon took 13 years to build his own house. And so he finished all his house. And, that's curious. The writer of the book of Kings says 7 years to build the temple, but 13 years to build his own house. Well, that might be innocent. Perhaps Solomon, pressed on with some urgency to build the temple of God, and then took a bit longer and more relaxed to build his own house. Maybe, or maybe his vanity, self-importance started to show, and he took twice as long to build his own house. Does that show? I mean, why does somebody need to build a house for 13 years?
The Kardashian.
I'm like, all right, so maybe the Kardashian family take that length of time. But you got to think, 13 years. What are you trying to achieve there? Trying to make a statement? Does it show some sort of a vanity, perhaps, a self-importance? Did you take longer to build your own house than the temple? It's just odd that the writer puts these. We've got chapter 7 there, but there's no chapter break in the original. It just says 7 years to build the temple, but 13 years to build his own house. That just might give us a little bit of a premonition that there's a little bit of a problem there. Let's move along to chapter 9. So we saw how God appeared to Solomon early on and gave him the opportunity to ask whatever he wanted. And he says, give me discernment and wisdom. And God said, you got it. You've also got riches and honor, which you didn't ask for. And if you walk before me faithfully, I will give you long life. I've said earlier, he probably died in his 50s. So you can sort of conclude something's gone wrong somewhere. Let's see how that happens. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. It came to pass when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all Solomon's desire which he wanted to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon the second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon, which we read earlier. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication that you have made before me. I have consecrated this house, the temple, which you have built to put my name there forever, and my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. Now why has God turned up again? He's already visited, Solomon maybe 20 years earlier, and given Solomon, wisdom and discernment and riches and honor. How often is God going to turn up in a man's life? So he's here a second time. Why? Well, we can see why, I think. Now, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. Okay, that's not dissimilar to the first time, but if you or your sons at all turn from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes which I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, this is the thing that really is going to annoy God, then I will cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and this house, this temple, which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight. Israel will be a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. And as for this house, which is exalted, everyone who passes by it will be astonished and will hiss and say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? Then they will answer, because they forsook the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, and worshipped them, and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this calamity on them. So this, if you look at it and think about it, that's a very different visitation from God in this dream. The first one was, ask what you want. God blesses him and says, if you obey me, I'll extend your life. God spends half of the time here talking about the calamities that will come if you turn to other gods and worship them. This to me is a strong warning. God's turning up, for a reason. He obviously loves Solomon. That's why he's been so willing to bless him and give him the throne. But now God's saying, look, if you turn from me, this bad stuff's going to happen to you, to your sons if they do it, to the nation if it does it, and even this temple, which is an astonishing building. I'll throw it away, so much refuse and rubbish, if you turn away from me. So that's really quite a strong warning that God's personally turned up to deliver to Solomon. So here's a wealthy man, super prosperous, wise. The whole world comes to hear him talk and give his opinions. So what's Solomon going to do now? Which way is he going to go? Going to be faithful to God? Loyal to God? Accept this warning? Or is he going to wander away from God? Well, 1 Kings 11, let's read verses 1 through 8. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, whom he'd married a bit earlier, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. The warning was there. The warning had been there for hundreds of years. Don't intermarry with these nations, because they'll turn your heart away to their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. I suspect more like lust, but wasn't there. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. 1,000 is 900 and something too many, right?
You've got one, and
I've got one, and I can't really cope with one. So how you cope with 1,000 is beyond me.
You've got me on eBay at the moment. We know.
Yeah, that highlights a problem. I mean, I think I said last week, David must have had a bit of a problem, because he had 7 wives, I think, and 10 concubines, and he still lusted after Bathsheba. It's not healthy. And 1,000 women, that's not healthy, right? For so it was, it tells us, didn't it? His wives turned away his heart from what? Well, from God, from Jehovah. For so it was when Solomon was old, I think that's a very much a relative term, I reckon he's probably in his 40s at this stage, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem. That's the Mount of Olives. So in sight of the temple to God is, idols. And for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, hundreds of them, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Solomon's engaged in massive idolatry. He's got probably hundreds of idols dotted all over Jerusalem, which is, his heart has turned away from Jehovah God to worship the gods of his foreign wives. Unlike David, David sinned, as we know, with Bathsheba, adultery, getting Uriah killed, so that's cover up and murder. But David never turned his back on God. He wandered off a little bit and sinned in a moment of weakness and so on. But David was always loyal to Jehovah God. That's his God. I don't think David ever looked at any other god or goddess, just the true God. And that was loyal and faithful, like you and I should be. But Solomon here has turned his back on Jehovah God. He's now worshipping and offering sacrifices to Molech and Chemosh and who knows what not. Not only terribly bad personally for him, but of course he's the king. He sets the example for the people of Jerusalem. And right in the, just 100 yards, 200 yards from the temple are idols of gods and goddesses, which are really, demons. That's a terrible place to be. So we know which way Solomon chose. He chose death. God set before him life and death, blessing and cursing. You choose, and Solomon chose curses and death. Heaven only knows why. Well, his wives were at fault. Cherchez la femme. Okay, verses 9 to 13. So the Lord became angry with Solomon. Well, after all God had done for the man, the wealth, the prosperity, the fame, the wisdom, the knowledge of how trees grow and how flowers pollinate and how bats find their way in the dark and so on. He knew all that. No wonder God became angry, because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. God hasn't appeared to me once, right? But he is twice. He turns his back on God. Verse 10, and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. That's why he turned up the second time, to say, Solomon, if you obey me, great. If you don't, these calamities will happen. That's why God came. And Solomon just basically ignored God. He did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this thing and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant, a man called Jeroboam. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, not Solomon's sake, but just respecting David that God did get on well with, and said, well, because of David, I'll leave you to finish your term. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I've chosen. God promised David, so God's going to make sure that David has a tribe to have a throne over, which would be the house of Judah in the south. But the 10 tribes, the northern tribes, they've been torn away and given to somebody else because, and that's just, I think, God's very disappointed here. So, God sets his plan in motion, and he sends a prophet to find Jeroboam and advise Jeroboam he's going to be the new king of the house of Israel, the northern 10 tribes. And of course, you can't keep that a secret. So Solomon finds out that Jeroboam, his servant, has been anointed to be the new king of Israel. So what does Solomon do there? Well, he could sort of realize his sin, the penny could drop. He could sort of think, oh, no, surely I've not been so foolish. He could have repented in sackcloth and ashes and sought some way to be reconciled to God, right? He could have done that. He's got a choice. So what does Solomon do? He knows that God has anointed a new man to be king. So Solomon accepts that with good grace. Well, chapter 11, and let's read verse 40. Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam. So that's God's anointed, and what's Solomon doing? Trying to kill him. That's not good, is it? But Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So get out of town fast. This town isn't big enough for the two of us. So, of course, Jeroboam on his camel down to Egypt. But just consider that. Solomon knows that Jehovah God has appointed a particular man to be the new king, and Solomon tries to kill him, which obviously is fighting Jehovah God, right? He's trying to thwart God's purpose, and that's really the last we hear of Solomon as a living king. He's opposing Jehovah God and trying to kill Jehovah God's new anointed king. Let's read verses 41 to 43. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And the period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Then Solomon rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. So it tells us there that Solomon reigned 40 years. So if he was 12, when he became king, he died at 52. If he was 18 when he became king, he died at 58. So I don't know for sure. But my conclusion, looking at Solomon's life, is that, he started off well. It's humble. God loved him. God blessed him. But as he got older, his 1,000 wives and concubines turned his heart away from God. He wasn't loyal and faithful to God as his father had been, even though God personally came in that second visit and said, look, be aware, be clear. If you follow faithfully, it'll be great. If you turn away, right, it's calamity for you, for your dynasty, for the nation. And what did he do? He turned away. Unbelievable. And I tend to think, my personal view is that Solomon will almost certainly be in the lake of fire. Right? Sorry, this is a sign that I'm speculating. Nebuchadnezzar. Because, that's how it ends. My view has been that Solomon, of course, he could have repented right at the very end. It's possible, right? In which case, great. I don't want to see Solomon in the lake of fire. Don't want to see anybody in the lake of fire. But if Solomon had repented, I think to make sure the record was straight, God would ensure there'd be a couple of sentences just saying, in his last few years, Solomon came to his senses, sackcloth and ashes, beat his chest and was fine. I think God would have ensured that the record was, accurate and fair in how it left us with Solomon's life. But it's not. It says he's trying to kill God's anointed. Then it says he died. So I reckon that's that, right? So I hope I'm wrong in some ways, but I think if I just go by the scripture, Solomon was wicked, latterly, very wicked latterly, terribly offensive to God to worship all these gods and goddesses and set the example for the people as well. That's a terrible place to be, and Solomon absolutely knew better. Look at Deuteronomy 17. If you turn there, back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Going to read verses 14 through 20. This is Moses, back in the days before they entered the promised land. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it and say, I'll set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, which they, of course, latterly did. Saul was the first, then David, then Solomon. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. This, of course, if you remember, spawned a lot of hostility to Barack Hussein Obama. Of course, lots of Americans said, well, he's not one of our brothers. He wasn't even born in this country. Lots of course, controversies and so on there. But that's the principle they were following, that you should have a king of your own people. Verse 16, but he shall not multiply horses for himself. 40,000 stalls, 12,000 horsemen. Nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, where we saw that as well. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself. 1,000, 3 or 4, 7 or 8. David at 17-ish, pushing a little bit there, but multiply 1,000. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. If you had to write your own copy, it might take you, a number of days or a few weeks, depending on how fast you were. Write your own copy of the scriptures as they were at the time and read it every day. Good advice, of course, for you and I, right? That he may learn to fear the Lord his God, be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel, if you do what God said, right? But Solomon clearly didn't do that. It's quite evident Solomon didn't read the words of the book every day of his life, not multiplying horses, multiplying wives, and all the rest of it. And it's another illustration, this, that, you reap what you sow. Saul reaped what he sowed. David reaped what he sowed. Solomon reaped what he sowed. Solomon sowed luxury, licentiousness, idolatry, huge idolatry, rebellion latterly, and what he's going to reap, unfortunately, is going to be the lake of fire, I suspect. Well, that's my conclusion, which I'm sticking to. And, one of the things it can tell us is that prosperity and fame, which we'd all perhaps quite like, does bring huge temptations, right? And not everybody can cope. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but suffers the loss of his own soul? So perhaps you and I are lucky sometimes, blessed not to be super prosperous or super famous. If you read the book of Ecclesiastes, which Solomon wrote, there's 2-3 passages there that seem to suggest that Solomon at times contemplated suicide because he knew that God's over there and he's over there and he's no intention of repenting and trying to get back to God, and he knows he's got no future. He knows only the blackness of darkness forever. That's why he felt, suicidal. Because prosperity and wives, you can't fill the spiritual vacuum you have if you don't have God. So, he had a good start, but he crashed and burned. And it's really important. You and I have started in this journey we've got, but it's not the start that's important, is it? It's how you and I finish. If only Solomon had chosen a life of righteousness and loyalty to God, he could have looked forward to eternal life, enjoy forever. But he didn't, did he? And hopefully you and I can learn from his mistakes and, of course, ideally do a lot better. And with that, we'll conclude today's Bible study.